I'm here today with my good friend, Ellen Bannister. Ellen is the academic program coordinator with the Center for Learning and Leadership. So did I get all that right?
You got all that right. Yeah, it took me several years just to say that without tripping on it. Yeah.
And Ellen and I don't know when we met. I've known you, it seems like, for a long time now, and we probably met at a conference somewhere. Seems like we're always crossing paths at either conferences or trainings or something. And I'm always happy to see your face because you got that great smile, and you always make sure that you come and say hello to me, and I appreciate that. Do you remember? I mean,
Yeah, I think we met at a conference several years ago, and I think we connected because we're both parents, and we were gravitating towards some of the same topics, right? So we were going to, and I'm trying to remember the conference, but I want to say it was possibly when the governor's conference was still going on. It may have been the last couple of years that they did that governor's conference.
could be.
And
I missed the governor's conference. I thought that was
oh, I
fun.
miss it too. Yeah, I think it was a great opportunity, and there are not enough opportunities, I think, to bring together the different partners that really need to be talking all the time.
Absolutely. So tell me your story. How did you get started in advocacy?
Yeah, I am in sort of a strange position as an advocate in that, you know, before I started working in the Center for Learning Leadership, I had only really done a little bit of advocacy because I was so busy. I've got two sons, Ben, who is now 16, and Elliot, who is now 12. And I was just like a hardworking parent with a husband who worked full time. I worked full time, and I was teaching as a writing instructor at OU, and I would take care of the kids during the day, teach my classes, and then grade all night. And I was just like keeping my head down. Most of my closest friends at that point were my kids' therapists. And as it turned out, one of the people who I befriended in that way, when a job came open at Center for Learning Leadership, she was like, "You know what, Ellen, you would really like this." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I would be really interested in that." And so she really learning to be an advocate. At that point, I had done some work with Tracy and Corey Sutton on their CLEAT training, which at that point was still not a CLEAT training, was a more informal training on autism for police officers. And so I participated in that training and was very impressed by it, and very interested in participating. And so when the opportunity came up to, Elliot got into school full time. He got old enough, he was in school, and so I was like, I need to do something else. And the opportunity came up right then, and so it has been a really interesting learning process.
Yeah, you learn something every day, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I do. I always do. Most of the time, it's about myself,
Yeah.
but at least lately, it has been for sure. So, tell me about your family. Tell me a little bit about the diagnosis and how that's kind of led you to where you're at.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I have two sons. Ben is 16. He is on the autism spectrum. He also, as an infant, he had some very early heart surgery. He had a genetic issue with his heart. It was surgically corrected at 2 weeks. And so a lot of the stuff that went on with Ben, we thought was connected to his heart. But as he got older, we were getting concerned. He was having language delays. We were a little confused about the whole thing because one of the things that Ben was always really good at was reading. He was a very early reader. So he started reading around 12 months. And so in our minds, we were sort of like, oh, well, he's not saying mommy and daddy, but he can read. And so because we didn't really know enough about it, we accepted that as sort of the rationale. And even we went to his pediatrician and we did a screening tool, and the pediatrician had the reading sort of reassured the pediatrician in the way that it had us. And so it was really easy to deny what was going on, which was that there were major issues going on with him in terms of communication, in terms of like the way he played, the way he communicated with others. There were all sorts of things going on that we ignored for a long time. And so another reason, so he ended up being diagnosed around 4. Part of the reason that happened is that his brother Elliot was born in that time. And Elliot, when he was 4 months old, we were at a well child visit. We thought he was colicky. He was crying a lot. And at this well child visit, they said, well, he seems to be doing okay. I did mention that his head was getting pointy. And they were like, oh, we should probably check that out. It ended up, the doctor called me almost immediately. We got a CT scan. He had hydrocephalus. They were like, okay, this is something big. We don't know what it is, but it's going to require surgery. We ended up having surgery for Elliot at 6 months. And then about at 1 year, he was diagnosed with Pfeiffer syndrome. And so within those first few months, he ended up having multiple surgeries. And Pfeiffer syndrome has meant that he's had, until a few years ago, he probably had a brain or skull surgery every year. And so we were on a schedule of a lot of, this whole pattern of recovery and, preparing for surgeries, going often out of state for surgeries, recovering from that. So Elliot was starting these surgeries. Oh yeah, sure.
Let me jump in, because for somebody like me that doesn't know, what is Pfeiffer syndrome? I've never heard of that.
Yeah. So Pfeiffer syndrome is a really rare genetic disorder that affects, maybe 1 in 100,000 people. Maybe it's even rarer than that. I think those are about the numbers I've heard. And what it means is that there are different, the skull ends up having some unusual things about it, right? The consistency of the bone, the way things are arranged. And so facially, you look different. You're also at greater risk for hydrocephalus, right? Fluid on the brain, and a variety of things. And so what it means is that for many kids and adults, even with Pfeiffer syndrome, you typically have a lot of surgery in your life. And so Elliot has had, he has a shunt. He has, he has stuff going on with his head, and other parts of his body, and so it has an impact in terms of how much time you're spending in hospitals. and around doctors and going to various specialists. Um, so when Elliot went into all this surgery, Ben was still not diagnosed. And so we ended up having a kind of moment where we had two kids getting these major life-changing diagnoses about the same time.
That's got to be life-changing for you also. I mean, people, we have
Yes.
these life-changing moments, but they don't realize that affects I mean, I guess they probably do, but that affects the whole family. I mean, but if you're like me, the good news is that you now know what's going on, and now we can move forward on helping. So, and I interrupted you. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I just thought it would be
Yeah,
important because,
that was absolute.
yeah.
Oh,
Um,
no.
So you were talking about then having the surgeries. So, uh,
Right. And so we were pretty busy in that beginning period of time. And yeah, and I think, for Ben's diagnosis, it was good news for us. It was because, we had a lot of question marks. And so at the time that we ended up getting diagnosed, I basically called the recommended, I waited, because you always wait. You never get in for the assessments when you're hoping you can, right? There's always a wait. But I called the therapist and I basically said over the phone, I pretty much was like, okay, so here's what's going on. We think it's blah, blah, blah. And she's like, yeah, that sounds right. That by the time we were at that point, we were, but interestingly, the first person to give a diagnosis to Ben of autism spectrum disorder was uh, uh, was a greeter at Walmart who had worked with many children on the spectrum over the years. And so I wouldn't say that this is best practice to have a Walmart greeter be the person who diagnosed your child, but she was like, so he's on the, basically, so he has autism, right? Um, yes.
and your response is, I don't know, but maybe. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, and of course, moms always know. I give you the dad's perspective. We're always behind on things. I don't know if that's the same for you, but I was in denial for probably 2 years, just like most dads. It was, there's nothing wrong, just delayed. He's coming around, that kind of thing, until you get that diagnosis. Even when we got the diagnosis, I was just kind of like, I don't know. That doesn't seem right. It took me a while to come around and say, hey,
Yeah.
I have this expert who is telling me it's autism. I need to put everything else aside and see what I can do to help. So is that kind of what you saw?
Yeah. Yeah, I think Bob and I both had plenty of denial around this. Because we had especially since we were really thrown by the reading. Now when Ben was diagnosed, we learned the term hyperlexia, which is some people with, and some people on the spectrum, and others do have this quality, hyperlexia, where you read really quickly. And he's always read with more comprehension than he's processed. So for instance, if you put the subtitles on a movie, he can understand it.
I think that's interesting. I've never heard hyperlexia. Is that what you said? Okay.
Yeah, hyperlexia.
I've
Yeah.
never heard of that until just now. But Connor always was a really good reader. I mean, he in the 5th and 6th grade, he was reading on a 12th grade level, but his comprehension was always low. And the reason why, especially when we got into middle school, his grades started to go down in reading and language, because when you start talking about figures of speech, idioms, he doesn't understand those. You know, it's raining cats and dogs, those kind of things in speech. And so we're talking about, that's when we get more into literature, where we use those things, those hyperboles and those things. And so his grades, we noticed, started going down. And I thought, the kid can read anything you put in front of him, but he wasn't understanding everything that he read. Does that make sense? And so, so when you brought that up, it sounds
Oh, that
similar. Yeah, it sounds similar, because Connor can read very well, but it sounds like Ben, right? Ben's comprehension was better than Connor's. So that's good. That's why we say everybody's different.
Also, Elliot, many siblings, right? As you know, if you have a sibling on the autism spectrum, you are more likely to, that there is some research that, you may possibly also have siblings who are on the spectrum. And Elliot, when we suspected he might also be on the autism spectrum, but he was always busy either preparing for surgery, getting surgery, or recovering from surgery. And so it didn't seem like there was a really good moment to start the testing. And so when he had a break about 3 years ago, we got some testing for him, and he also was identified as being on the autism spectrum.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me along the way, who are some of your mentors? Who are people that have kind of helped you with your advocacy? Is I mean, you're involved in a little bit of everything. Just about every conference that I go to, every training, you're there. So tell me who are some of your mentors?
So I would say that the person who got me off the sidelines and got me to start doing some advocacy was Tracy Sutton. The Suttons were really important for me, and just like, first of all, you have something to say, right? You have a perspective that can be useful for other people to hear, and you have the things I was doing as a writing instructor, right, which is leading groups of people, sharing information, doing these sorts of things, teaching, mentoring, is very similar to what I do now. But I wouldn't have thought about that before I got started. And so, but at CLL, of course, I've been just crazy lucky to be learning from people who are so knowledgeable about what they do. And so, I'm surrounded by Wanda Felty and Erica Herrera and Roseanne Percival and all these people who are doing incredible things. And I also got to take partners a few years ago, which I was really excited to do. And I learned so much from all of them, right? Erin, of course, I always enjoy her perspective. Jen Randall, I've learned so much from. It's been very, as you say, I get to learn something every day. And so I came in with a lot of lived experience of being a parent, and so I could tell you a lot about, okay, so you went to the hospital thinking you were going to go home in an hour and you stayed a week. What'd you bring? I had a lot of that kind of experience, but I didn't understand the advocacy world. I didn't understand many of the systems that supported people. And, there were just some basics that I had flown right over my head. So like Ben was diagnosed too late to be in any of the early intervention systems, right? And so he went from diagnosis to school, right? That was pretty much, where he went. Um, it took me till I was working at CLL, which I think this is maybe year 5. Oh my God. Uh, it took me till then to really understand what the DDS waiver was about and why we needed to be on the waiting list. So there's just a lot that I had to learn.
I still, the waiver, it's still kind of, and I've been doing this for, I don't know, 8 years or so, I guess. Well, probably a little longer than that, even if you look back at Connor's diagnosis, because that's when I started with him. But and the waiver still, there are parts of it that are a mystery to me. But you talk about, I love helping people. I love my job because I get to help people every day, and I love helping all people. But I really like those what I call newly diagnosed parents. And I know that's probably not grammatically correct, but you understand what I'm saying. Those
Yeah.
that have just received the diagnosis, because I can remember being there, and I can remember having that diagnosis and thinking, now what? Where do we go? What do we do? And in where we come from in rural Poto America, in the middle of nowhere, things are limited here. And so I really like being here so that when I get those phone calls, parents can say, what do I do now? And I can be that person that I wish I had,
Yeah.
So, and I think that's kind of what you were saying just a second ago is where do we go? Where do we start? It's because it's scary. It's a scary world. I mean, it's a scary world without a diagnosis of a disability. So, so.
Yeah. And being a parent is such a huge undertaking, right? Not just a child with a disability. It's just, because you're responsible for another person's life suddenly. And so you have this huge, and I haven't noticed, for instance, that when I look around, parenting is just hard.
What's funny is what you just said. I joke with my boys, but I'm not really joking. And I tell them, I got one job, and that's to keep you alive. That's it.
Yeah.
And it's not eeasy.
No, it takes so much work to keep a child alive. Yeah.
So, advice. What is maybe the best piece of advice you've ever received, and what's something that you try to pass on to other people?
I think for me, the best advice I've received is that it's okay to say no to some things, right? So when your kids are just diagnosed, right, people want to be helpful, and so they're like, okay, so you need to go to like these, you need to go to these 20 therapy appointments, you need to do all this stuff all at once, and it's super important, and it's, basically it's all in your hands. It's super important. You've got to do it all. And I think that at that point, people just get in therapy world, right? And so doctors' appointments in therapy world, and you just stay there, right? You can, and you're not having a life, but you don't notice you're not having a life because all your time is taken up. And I think having permission to say, you know what, no, a lot of that is important, but you know, your child will probably learn more from a birthday party, right, about social interaction than they will from 5 visits with an adult therapist, right? That there's a lot of stuff that you can learn in just natural settings, and it doesn't all have to be like official therapy world.
Yeah, and I always have this conversation with parents because, especially again, those newly diagnosed parents we get out of an IEP, and they're like, I'm only getting occupational therapy 30 minutes twice a week. They really need more than that. And I wanted to explain to them two things. Number one, therapy doesn't stop when you leave that 30 minutes. You need to get with the therapist and say, hey, what are you working on? Let's work with them at home on these same things. And so you continue that therapy throughout the week. But the second part of that is you can get burned out. Your child will get burned out if all you're doing is going to therapy and not living, So,
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, what you really want, what I want for my kids is I want them to, I have one in high school and one in middle school now. And, I want them to be finding out what they like to do. I want them to be hanging around friends, right? I want them to have friends who they can hang out with. And I want them to learn and grow, and none of that is necessarily done in therapy, even though therapists are incredibly sneaky and insightful people, and I always want therapists as allies, right? And I and I'm not against OT and PT and speech, certainly.
Yeah, I think that's important to throw out there is we're not saying don't get the
No.
therapy. You need the therapy. And in fact,
Yeah.
when we have a diagnosis, the first thing I ask is, what kind of therapies? Are they getting occupational therapy? Are they getting speech therapy? Do they
Yeah.
need physical therapy? And you need those things, but we don't need to overdo it, is what
Yeah.
I'm really thinking. And our
Yeah.
our good, our mentor, if you will, Patrick Schwartz, um, talks
Yeah.
about,
He's
he's
great.
amazing, but he talks about how is my son going to learn how to be socially accepted if he's not among his peers,
Yeah.
and so that's important. Let's get them out there. Let's let them learn from others. So I think that's,
Yeah.
yeah. That's all I've got. I, do you want to tell a little bit about the Center for Learning and Leadership? What, I don't think Wanda
Sure.
went into that. We went into other things. I think we went into waiting lists with her. So tell a
Yeah.
little bit about what the Center for Learning and Leadership is.
Yeah. So the Center for Learning and Leadership is in every state, there's at least one center at a university that is funded under the DD Act. So there are 3 organizations that are in Oklahoma. It's the Developmental Disabilities Council of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Disability Law Center, and the Center for Learning Leadership, which, if you want to give it its full, to add more words to it, it's Oklahoma's federally designated University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. So yeah, that
That
took
was
me a long
impressive.
time.
Very good.
Yes, yes. And so we work in different areas. The mission of the Center for Learning Leadership is for people with developmental disabilities to be valued members of their community, right? And I think I just got the wording wrong there, but and their families, right? We want people, let me try that again. We want people with disabilities and their families to be valued participants in their communities. And we do that through training, community training, training for students, training for professionals who are already working. We do that by providing information to people with disabilities, to their families, and to professionals who work with them in things like we have a guide to community services. And I actually learned a lot about services because I was one of the editors of that guide. And so I came out of that process learning a lot about the way systems are put together, and finally got my mind around some of, Medicaid and, things like that. Not all of it, because it is way complicated from my perspective. We also are involved in working with researchers in different ways, in different areas, who are working on issues that have to do with developmental disabilities. And so let's see, products. Let me see. I'm probably missing one. And we also set up model services like the 360 Center, which helps at this point primarily Spanish-speaking families whose children have developmental disabilities and are Medicaid eligible. The center helps them find information connected to social supports, and also find those day-to-day services.
That's great.
So that was a great, big, long, confusing answer.
That's all right. That's but that tells everybody, a little bit more about Center for Learning and Leadership. I know a little bit of that. I didn't know some of that, so that's why we do this. I like to get the word out, and that's why I love doing these interviews. Is I'm learning, everybody else hopefully is learning a little bit, and they get to see people that are just like them. I mean, you're a parent. I'm a parent. It took us just getting out there and meeting people and learning a little bit more to help our families, and that's why we do what we do. And so, there's plenty of room for more help. So,
yes.
All right. Well,
yes.
That's all I've got. I want to say that I appreciate everything that you do. I appreciate our friendship, and that you took the time out of your busy day. I know you've got a busy schedule.
Oh, well, I know you do too. This is quite a time. This is, well, I really appreciate what you do. And I think that, I think this is great, especially during this period right now with COVID. I think coming up with new ways to reach out to people and connect is really the way to go.
Well, thank you so much.